Hello, welcome everybody to our April Roundtable. I am in Toronto, or Midisai, editor of Move Smartly, joined by Steve Zaretsky in Vancouver. Hi, Steve.
Good to be back.
And John, you are with me here in Toronto. How are you doing?
Very good, very good.
I was just saying,
haircut.
Was that?
John, your haircut.
I know, fresh haircut. The YouTube trolls got to me. I finally buckled in and got a haircut. Here we go.
I don't recognize you. I don't like this.
All right. Well, it's
he's got the cut for the new bull market. Fresh new cut.
That's it.
But it's spring, it's Easter. Everyone's trying to like renew, right? So
Exactly.
hopefully we will see things a little bit brighter. It's actually really gray right here in Toronto right now. Steve, how's it in Vancouver? Pretty sunny?
Yeah, sunny. Heading to Calgary this weekend, so it's the land of the sunshine as well. So no complaints.
I feel like we've swapped cities this winter. It's been a gray one here. I don't like it. I would rather cold and bright, but I can't control the weather.
Come on down.
Or the housing market. But let's see if we can brighten things up with our chat this month. So a lot has been happening. Let's just start with our regular on the ground and by the numbers update. John, let's start in Toronto. You recently tweeted March stats from your website, and can you walk us through what the numbers showed? You had some key takeaways.
Yeah. So, I mean, at an aggregate level, sales are still down quite a bit from the peak. Prices are down about 15%. I think the key trends that I noticed this month are the low-rise market and the condo market are doing slightly different things. I mean, low-rise meaning semi-detached, detached homes, freehold townhomes. Inventory levels are plummeting. I mean, we started at, I think, 2.6 months of inventory start of the year. Now we're just over 1 month of inventory, which is like an insanely tight market. And prices for low-rise homes are actually starting to trend up. I mean, they've been bouncing around 1.3 million since around August. And they've kind of hovered right around that 1.3 million range. And last month in March, we hit 1.38 million. And that's the highest level prices, average prices, and actually median prices have been at for low-rise homes since June. Inventory levels are at their tightest level, I think, since May. So it's a very competitive market. I mean, kind of very similar trends that we've been talking about the past couple of months when we started talking about the market heating up. But we're actually starting to see it reflected in average prices right now for houses. And that's just by virtue of the fact that there's so many people competing for them. There's just not enough inventory. And, people are starting to pay a bit of a premium when they're bidding on homes. Now, the condo market is also competitive in the sense that there's only like a month and a half of inventory, but it's not as fiercely competitive as low-rise homes. Like there's not as many showing, there aren't as many offers. Like condos are selling quickly, but because it's not as competitive, we're not seeing as much upward pressure on prices for condos. So condo prices have been relatively steady and flat, I'd say, since the summer. So we're not seeing quite as much upward pressure on the condo market, but the low-rise market is just insane right now. It's very competitive.
And how does that feel, John? Like in terms of if you're out trying to buy in Toronto right now, what are your clients seeing? What does it feel like when you're at open houses?
I mean, it's crazy. I mean, I just posted a thread on the weekend. A client of ours was bidding on a home in Durham. It had 20 offers on it. They put in a price that was pretty reasonable. They were told they were way too low. And like late at night, they were basically told that the seller rejected all of the offers because none of them met their expectations. And they're just going to wait to get what they want. And I think they're going to increase their price. And then another home that they were close to getting, but the seller had unrealistic expectations, and they put in a decent offer, but not quite what the seller wanted. Similar, the seller basically said, you know what, we're taking off the market. We're going to wait 3 weeks. Hopefully prices are going to increase to what we want. So it's like the sellers in some ways are like kind of controlling the market right now. And I guess some buyers, because they feel pretty desperate, they just want a home, they just want to move on, they're having kids or, whatever it is. A lot of people, even though sales are low, a lot of people who are moving needs to move for certain life changes that are going on. feel very motivated and kind of pressured to buy. And that's kind of motivating some people to just kind of bid a little bit aggressively. And that's why we're seeing this slight uptick in prices. So it's very, very frustrating for buyers right now, I'd say.
And Steve, in Vancouver, you tweeted recently, call it a bull trap, call it a bear market rally, call it whatever you want, but home prices are absolutely moving higher right now. I suppose 20-year lows in listings will do that. So is it the same story in Vancouver? And are you seeing that split between houses versus condos?
Yeah, I think this is like a really important conversation because, John and I have always been on here, whether it's good news or it's bad news, we're always just trying to sort of sift through the information to say this and this is what's happening in the market. And so, I think a lot of people are frustrated. They're annoyed. They don't want to believe that, the conditions could have changed, that this is, maybe this is a false breakout, and it could very well be. But the reality is the market has shifted dramatically in the last 3-4 months. And that's not an understatement. So it's I understand there's rates are still at 5%. We're talking about banking crises in the US that could potentially emanate issues here. We're talking about a recession that we may or may not be going into in the very near term. So there's a lot of risks that are out there. But at the end of the day, on the micro level, in the near term, it's about supply and demand, and there's no supply, and you still have people that need to transact. And so if you look at like sales, and this is where I think it gets interesting, because I think there's going to be a lot of people that are getting confused. The general public is going to read a media headline, or they're going to read a real estate report that comes out and says, hey, well, in Greater Vancouver, sales were down 43% or 41% on a year-over-year basis. That doesn't sound very good. But you have to factor in the other side. I mean, you're going to have low sales transactions if there's nothing for you to buy. And so when we kind of put all this information together, you've got the lowest. So if you look at March inventory levels, it was the fewest number of listings for any March. You had to go all the way back to March of 2001 to see a lower print on the number of new listings being, hitting the MLS in the month of March. If you look at standing inventory, which is now the number of homes that are actively on the market for sale that you can go out and buy today, total inventory on the market is the lowest on record, dating back to data that I have, which goes back to 2005. So we have March standing inventory is the lowest we've seen in almost 20 years. And so this is the problem. And we're now seeing multiple offers. And when you get multiple offers, you tend to get higher prices. So you can imagine a scenario if you're a home buyer, if you're looking in the market in August, September, October, you had no competition. Listings were sitting, sentiment was horrible. You could go into the seller and say, hey, listen, I know you're listed at 1.6, but I'm going to offer you 1.45, and that's all I'm going to give you. And there was no other competing bids, and they were on the market for 2 months. So you could negotiate really good prices. Today, you get 50 groups at the open house. They set an offer date, and you end up with 8 offers. And so when you end up with, competing with 7 other people, of course, you're going to pay a higher price. So the buyer no longer has a leverage in terms of negotiating the price. And we're seeing prices, I would say in most product types are right now is moving higher.
So it's I'm going to call it the curious case of the very busy, but very small spring market, because the volume of sales is way down. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, hey, like, don't get me wrong. If you're a realtor, you're a mortgage broker, and your lifestyle or your salary depends on turnover. Yeah, like turnover is still weak. I mean, if you look at sales, they're still well below 10-year averages. And there's not a lot to list. There's not a lot to sell. So there's just fewer transactions, but the transactions that are happening at, I would say, quite a decent amount higher in terms of prices compared to 3, 4, 5, 6 months ago.
So, and John, you tweeted eager buyers, outrageous prices, scenes from the spring housing market. Who could have imagined the housing market would be this competitive with rates above 5%? And that draws again, and I think you're then quoted as going on to say it's the very low listing. So bear with me for a second. I like sports analogies. This is a bit of a sad one, but in stadium sports, there's something known as the crush. When too many fans are trying to get into a building and there's nowhere for them to go because there's an overcrowding situation. Is the housing market experiencing that in Canada right now? Buyers have decided, forget it. It's probably going to, rates are going to start attenuating. And by the time I get back in, things will start boiling over again. So I might as well start getting back into the market. Meanwhile, sellers have nowhere to go. The sellers that would normally upsize or downsize are looking at requalifying at very high mortgage rates and are probably not in a position to do that. Is that an analogy that holds water for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, I think it is when sales tanked in 2022 in the second half, I mean, those buyers didn't disappear, right? Like they just kind of moved to the sidelines, right? And partly out of fear because they saw prices were falling. And the market was very slow, even in the fall of last year. Like prices were just still, the houses were sitting on the market. Nice houses that today would get 15 offers were getting no offers and stay on the market for 2-3 weeks. And then, at some point, these buyers just kind of threw in the towel in January and February, said, you know what, I need to move on. I need to buy a home. And that really contributed to this increase in demand. And demand is soft as it is, like you don't need a massive increase. You just need like a marginal increase, kind of a huge impact when inventory is so low. And to your point, 100%, one of the challenges right now is that upsizing, quite frankly, is a massive luxury, more of a luxury today than when it was when rates were 2%, right? It's a lot harder to upsize to that much nicer home when you're paying 5% on your mortgage, when you're qualifying at 7+%. And that when we think about if there are fewer upsizers, I mean, upsizers are basically the ones who are buying kind of newer build, more expensive homes who are, again, selling their existing homes. So if people aren't upsizing, that's creating a bit of a bottleneck and, of course, constraining listings. So definitely, I think that's one of the things that are contributing. And the fact that, investors, quite frankly, that hold investment property, I think is the other thing, because usually they're the first ones to buckle. Like in a pessimistic down bear market, it's the investors who are the first to exit. And we kind of saw that in 2020 at the start of COVID. Condo investors just rushed to sell, which is why condo prices fell quickly in Toronto, at least. But that's not happening right now. And it's not happening because they're bullish. Banks are working with them with their mortgages. They don't feel distressed. They can hold on. So I think all of these factors are kind of helping kind of keep listings off the market. But the demand for housing is still there. And you can't get rid of that.
And on the downsizing side, do you find that sellers are holding off because they're not necessarily seeing the prices they were seeing before the decline started mid last year or after February, March last year? So is there even disincentive for those downsizing who would normally move because they feel like they want to hang on until prices recover completely?
I think that's less of an issue with downsizers because usually downsizers have been in the home for so long. I feel like they're less sensitive about making an extra $100,000. Like at the end of the day, they're buying something smaller. They're less concerned about. It's usually the upsizers who feel more impacted by that. But the issue with downsizers is that like people are just staying in their homes for a long time. So you have one or two people sitting in a 4-bedroom home, right? And I think that's been one of the challenges with Toronto. It's that we have a lot of people who in fact aren't downsizing. They're kind of staying in their 4-bedroom detached homes for a long time. And that's one of the reasons why there isn't a ton of inventory right now.
So Steve, are you seeing the same now? Stadium crushes are dangerous. And I'm wondering, is there a risk involved here for buyers that are active right now? If something changes, and I guess my first question is, do you anticipate something to change that would see, for example, listings to start recovering to higher levels? If that changes, is there a danger that some of these buyers could get caught out, that they're in a bit of a temporary price surge?
It's a good question. I get that question a lot from like clients and stuff. They go, well, should I wait till the summer? And I'm like, well, you've got record low inventory levels. Nothing is going to change in 2 months. You can't go from record low inventory to oversupplied, which pushes prices down in a matter of 2 months. So it's going to take many, many months to build inventory levels from rock bottom lows to a level which is even just like considered healthy. So not that much is going to change in the next 2 to 3 months. Now, obviously, the course can be altered. If rates for whatever reason need to go higher, Bank of Canada steps back to the table, and you get maybe you get like these banking crises emanate, and you get a recession and job loss, and obviously job loss is where you get forced selling. So there's definitely still risk. So I think anyone that's out there buying today, again, I always say, if you're going to buy something, make sure you're prepared to hold it for, more than 2 or 3 years. You got to make sure you're buying a place you're going to enjoy for the next 7, 8, 9, 10 years, because it significantly reduces the amount of risk. Because I think there's still going to be a lot of volatility in the next 12 months. And I think to, John's conversation is that it could be, I think perhaps what is enabling some people to defer listing. There's been a lot of volatility. The last 12 months has not been a smooth ride for real estate. You've had 400 basis points in increases, huge drop off in sales. Sentiment goes from horrible to worse to all of a sudden you're back into multiple offers. It is not, so people, the one thing to sort of keep in mind too is we've seen this huge move in mortgage rates. Let's say people that are on a fixed mortgage rate and you want to upsize, like you need to port that mortgage, and you typically only get 120 days to port the mortgage. So in a market where there's very little inventory and you're worried about finding something, if you sell your home first, you've got 4 months to find a place, not only find a place, but you got to close on it too. So, and people go, I don't want to lose my mortgage rate of 1.9% and then I have to take a full mortgage at 4.9. So I think that's like, there's a lot of moving pieces, I think, like in the market that people sort of need to understand. And so, the macro matters, but on a micro level right now, I think the micro is dwarfing the conversation.
So definitely a bottlenecking you're seeing. Now, so both of you have commented that the condos and the houses situation is looking differently. John, in Toronto, you're saying the condo sector is competitive. And that means the inventory is low, but the prices are not increasing as rapidly. And that leads me to a viewer question from Shashant, who asks, is this a peak for condo prices? Are about $4,000 per month cost for an average 2-bedroom condo with 20% down? So Steve just spoke about moving pieces. So your answer is probably, we don't know.
It's a hard question, because it's hard to say if we're at a peak. So the point is, you're right, that the carrying costs on a condo are something like $4,000 a month, say, whereas the rent on it is like $2,500 or whatever it is, right? So the math doesn't make sense for any investor who has bought recently and needs to finance at today's interest rates, right? Some buyers are still buying because they just want their own condo. Have prices peaked? It's hard to say that, because inventory keeps plummeting. Do you know what I mean? Like, usually, inventory kind of needs to move in the other direction for you to start calling a bit of a peak, right? And right now we're seeing less and less inventory every month. So it's hard to say if it's at a peak. I suspect we're probably going to see more inventory over time, but again, it's still too competitive right now, and the inventory is too tight to say that this is a peak. I don't know if condo prices are going to do what houses are doing, which is see an uptick from here. It's very possible. I have no idea. Like, if people get priced out of low rise, they're going to move to condos at some point. So yeah, I don't know. I can't, it's tough to say. I think it's probably still too early. We would need to see a shift in the market before we saying, okay, this is a bit of a peak. And right now, every week kind of inventory gets lower and lower.
So for investors.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, I think we can both agree. Like, I think it's a very, very confusing market. I think that, like it's interesting, right? I think no doubt, like, the economy's slowing, and I think 5% mortgage rates sustained, I think, are going to take its toll on a lot of households. But like it's so, yeah, you think naturally, like, well, man, like, prices should come down. There should be more stress. Like, we should start to see, slowing economy, job loss. But again, like, it takes time. And I think the reality is right now we've got very low inventory, and people are, I think, psychologically, when you start seeing 20, 30, 40 groups through an open house, people start to panic because they've been through this cycle so many times, which is our housing market turns into an absolute mess. Once we go through these little bottoms and it starts to tick up again, and people don't want to be in situations where they feel like they might have missed an opportunity.
Oh yeah, in 2008, we thought it would take so long to recover. After COVID, we thought it would take so long to recover. So I can understand the panic on the buyer side. Now, going back to the condo question, do you think there's finally maybe a shift in calculus? Is there a shift where the investor question no longer makes sense at all? It is wildly distorted. They cannot recover, for example, monthly carrying costs through rents alone. Mortgage costs are wildly outpacing them, and that makes the shift favor a little bit more maybe the end buyer who doesn't necessarily have to think through all of that. Could we start to see a bit of a reduction in investor demand?
I think we're seeing that in the resale market. I don't know what Steve's seeing, but we're not seeing a ton of investors buying, because the math doesn't make sense at today's prices and today's rates, right? I think the few that are buying maybe pre-con still are just hopeful rates are going to be lower in 5 years and rents will be higher. They're still bullish investors, right? I don't want to say there's no investors, but they're not as active in the resale market, because if you're buying a condo today, you're paying 5% on your mortgage, and you'd have to put 40% down for that math to work. So at least for now, I think. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and even in the pre-con area, Steve, we're seeing a huge fall in starts projected. New projects are not probably going to go ahead, so there is a massive drop off in demand on that side as well.
Yeah, I think the investor side here is, to John's point, is still quite tepid. I think we're seeing more. I'm personally seeing more investors cleaning up their balance sheet. Okay, we had 3 condos, sell 1. And liquidate, get some more cash, have a buffer as you're going into what I think a lot of people feel is a downturn, and cleaning that up. So the numbers don't really work today. You're almost hoping that you buy today, and 3 years time, and you renew your mortgage, that the rates are going to be lower, the rents are going to be up. So I think there's a lot of things that have to go right in order for this investment to make sense. And I think that's a big gamble. And I know there's certainly people that are willing to take it still in the pre-sale market. I think that's a different breed of investors. But I think for the most part, what we're seeing, most of the demand is really just these people that need to transact, young families that they got 2 kids, a third on the way. They can't wait any longer, young first-time home buyers that have been renting for the last 9 years. They got the cash, they're ready to go. Now's the time. So that's the kind of, I think, people that we're seeing transacting in the market today.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, end users are getting a little bit nervous that maybe things will rush again after a downturn. And it looks like only the hardiest investors right now remain in. Whereas, if you look at post-pandemic, even before then, every other person was turning into an investor, thinking they would pick up a condo as part of their financial portfolio. So definitely that is cooled off.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So that'll be interesting to track. Now, let's touch briefly on rents before we move on. Steve, you mentioned that overall in Canada, the rental prices, they're still eye-watering. I think you had a tweet here, average around just above 2,000 in November per month, attenuating a bit. Now, this is Canada-wide. So I think your chart shows that in February, that's dipping a bit under 2,000. And I'm sure I know Toronto trends well above that, Vancouver, I'm sure as well. But there's signs that there's a bit of moderation in rents. And I'm wondering why you think that is and what's going on there.
Yeah, I think that we don't have a lot of great rental data in this country. And so, you're looking at some of the data, but you're also just, a lot of it's just anecdotal, conversations with investors, conversations with property managers on, a weekly, monthly basis. And from what we're hearing and seeing is basically the rents have more or less kind of peaked out. They peaked out kind of more or less last summer. Don't get me wrong, the rental market's still blistering hot. It's still competitive. There's still not a lot to go out there and rent. So it still sucks to be, a prospective renter. But we're not necessarily seeing the prices continue to escalate higher. We're seeing some moderation in the growth. And so I think that's an important context, because again, I think people get confused when the stats come out and they read a media headline that says rents in Vancouver are up 16% year over year. It's like, okay, yes, they're up 16% from this time in March of 2022. But in reality, they've really basically have gone nowhere for the last 6 months. So I think it's just understanding how a lot of the data is interpreted and how it's reported.
And John, I believe we're at an eye-watering average price of $2,400 for a one-bedroom in Toronto right now. And again, to Steve's observations, do you see signs of that moderating around that level?
Yeah, we've seen rent prices moderate the past little while in the GTA. I mean, I tend to think, at least a Toronto perspective, that I think a lot of that is seasonal, or part of that is seasonal. Like, this is usually a pretty sluggish time to rent anything, and usually rents actually dip this time of year. I don't know. I think there's still potential for like upward pressure in rents as we hit like the spring summer market. That's really when we're going to see, like, if rents have kind of hit a ceiling, we'll kind of know by spring summer, because that's usually the peak season. But my instinct is, unfortunately, that I think there still might be pressure on rents, because if prices are ripping, which is what they are right now, and it's too competitive, and they're trending up and it's hard to buy a home, like, at the end of the day, people need a place to live. And I'm just worried that we might see, probably not like last year, like 20% growth, but we'll probably see, I think, some upward pressure on rents as we move to the spring, summer.
Yeah. Okay. So let's keep an eye on that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's definitely some seasonality to rent. So I think that's a fair observation.
And that makes sense. And that seasonality is because people tend to move around certain days. Like, I think July 1st is that the biggest moving day still for renters in Canada?
Yeah, I think it's in that bracket. Basically try not to have a tenant lease expire in December, January.
It's the worst. It's the worst.
Okay, so we'll keep an eye on rents and see how they progress. Now, I think it's back to our usual segment, Interest Rate Corner, but this one is a bit of a doozy. So I'm going to do a bit of a recap over what happened this past month, because it's been a crazy month for headlines. So just after we met, I think on March 7th, we chatted last at our roundtable. The next day, we saw a change in the pace of rate hikes for the first time since this hiking cycle began, since the Bank of Canada started last March. And on March 8th, the next day, the Bank of Canada held its policy rate for the first time, on which variable rate mortgages are largely based, and holding at 4.5% for the first time in a long time. And then within a few days, we started seeing, and I think it was 2 or 3, 3 US banks fail, starting with the Silicon Valley Bank. And then very remarkably, the huge Credit Suisse Bank collapse in Europe happened. This did lead the market rush towards bonds, towards safety, which resulted in both Canadian and US bond yields on which fixed mortgage rates are based, falling for the first time, again, in a long while. And though that took a while to filter through, some new borrowers looking at rates have seen lower rates, again, for the first time in a long time. And then only a few weeks later, on March 22nd, the US Fed raised its rate by 25 basis points, but that was a smaller increase than many expected. Many expected 50 basis points, some even 100. And it seemed like, the banking turmoil and collapse had basically done half their heavy lifting for them. So there was a little bit of a back off there. And then to round this all out, we had the federal budget release. Canadian Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland presented her budget for the year, which made very notably the changes that we were talking, that you were explaining informally. Banks were working with mortgage holders, to keep them in their homes, allowing them to extend amortization and offering some other flexibility as mortgage borrowers really face the strain of increased mortgage payments. It was done informally. I made the comment that it really shouldn't be happening, should it? And this federal budget then went ahead and regularized that, or even encouraged it. John, you tweeted here, today's federal budget confirmed that banks have a lot of flexibility in restructuring mortgages to ensure owners aren't forced to sell due to today's much higher interest rates. So if we're wondering where all the other listings have gone, they're being propped up. Is that fair to say, John?
Well, yeah, 100%. Yeah, and we talked about that. 100. That's a huge factor that is keeping people in their homes. I mean, if everyone's mortgage payment was going up with variable, I mean, we'd have a very different market, especially with investors. We'd be seeing quite a few more listings hitting the market. And the fact that the bank almost formalized that they're trying to support households is it's a massive variable that is not typical in housing market slowdowns. You know what I mean? So it's very interesting that they're kind of going out of their way to support the housing market this way.
And on our Move Smartly channel, I think you had a recent interview. Oh, it's coming up later today with Robert Kavchik, who noted that banks are behaving a bit differently than they have in previous housing downturns.
Yeah,
this is not something we saw before.
Yeah, he even mentioned that. I mean, when I asked him, like, what makes this different from, the US housing crisis and even the housing crash in Toronto in the late 80s and early 90s, I mean, this is one variable that was very different. I mean, in the Toronto in the 90s, a lot of that was also unemployment that kind of, and again, that's the one variable that you can't control that kind of causes people to but even in the case of unemployment, it's funny. I mean, we had that in COVID and the banks and the federal government still didn't care. Like, just don't pay your mortgage for 6 months. We'll figure it out, right? So even in the face of unemployment, it seems like the federal government's going to do what they can to kind of keep people in their homes. And certainly now with higher interest rates, they're going out of their way to support households. And I'm not saying all of that is terrible, but I think it's certainly problematic when you have CIBC saying that 20% of their mortgage holders aren't even covering the interest on their mortgage payments. I mean, that's like, it's amazing how we got to this point, like safe, stable Canadian banking system. Now we have like negative amortizations. Like it's remarkable that we've
so people aren't even paying off their loan, really. They're accruing. Yeah. And so Steve? if they're kicking the can down, Steve, I gather you think they're going to start punting the can down the road. You think there might even be more to come with things?
I just think the cynic in me tells me that they're, look what their actions are doing, basically what they're saying, what they're doing. I don't think it's politically acceptable in order of, governments try to do what they need to do to get reelected. And I don't think having, 20% of borrowers out on the streets in foreclosure is a good way to get reelected. So while there's certainly a cohort that I understand that wants lower house prices don't necessarily get you reelected. So I think this is the struggle that, I had a couple of clients said, hey, did you see the federal budget that came out? I'm getting bullish now on housing and I want more for my house. Because you look at the spending. I mean, I put a good report out there from Scotiabank's Derek Holt, their chief economist, and I think he wrote a pretty scathing report. I mean, this is a big bank economist that's supposed to be fairly neutral to come out and just destroy that government and say that their budget is completely reckless. I think it's really illuminating. I mean, we talked at the beginning of the show here about like potential job losses. We're going to recession. Obviously, the Bank of Canada is fighting inflation, but then you've got the federal government, which is just they're still stimulating. Mm-hmm. So, and this is I think arguably why you can see that we don't have this as much softness in housing anymore, because I think what they're doing is they're counteracting the Bank of Canada. So it's going to be interesting. Again, I think I would encourage people to go read Derek Holt's his report, because I think he was saying something like over 60% of all the new jobs that have been created since the pandemic are in the public sector. So it's basically government spending money, getting larger, creating new jobs. And it's hard to have a high unemployment rate if the government keeps spending and creating jobs in the public sector.
Right. And where did we see that? We saw COVID related spending in the labor, propping up.
And then there, and then to that point, I mean, they're, pulling in 1 million people a year and still no housing plan. So, I can see both sides of the argument. I think you've got pretty compelling arguments for the bearish side. You got compelling arguments for the bullish side. The bullish side being you're still pulling in 1 million people a year and the government's still spending like they're in a deep, deep recession.
Right. So I think before we move on to maybe some of those, the demand side, gasoline, pouring gasoline on the fire issues, let's just finish up with like viewer question, Steve. I think this is great for you, from Raymond Wong. Do you think we will have inflation problem again, an inflation problem again after what we learned of the federal budget? If yes, do you think the Bank of Canada will start to hike again? It seems like the government of Canada wants inflation and the Bank of Canada is fighting it.
I definitely think, I personally think we'll probably have a double top in inflation. I think we're right now going through this disinflation. You can see it in bond yields right now. I think that we're in this like regime though, where governments, not just the Canadian government, but governments at all levels are basically spending money because it feels good, and it is what it is. So I definitely think we're gonna have like a double top. I don't know what the Bank of Canada is gonna do, because I think it's one and the same, right? Like I think there's so much debt in the system that it's really hard to materially raise interest rates. And that's why I think we've seen the Bank of Canada obviously take a step back, despite inflation still being elevated. And we're seeing now what raising rates is doing to some of these banks in the US. So I think it's a tough situation. It is what it is.
Yeah, and you and your colleagues spoke a little bit more at length on that on your recent Loonie Hour show, which was very interesting. John, your final thoughts on this before we turn to
I'm cautious too. I mean, I think it's very possible we might see inflation tick up. I mean, we're so vulnerable to not just the government spending, to oil prices. I mean, OPEC cutting, like all of this stuff. It's some things are just out of, the government's control. So I think we have to be prepared for it. And it's hard to see again, if inflation picks up, a lot of the mood has been rates are going to be being cut by the end of the year. But again, a lot of this is a function of where inflation is, and inflation is sticky and starts ticking up again. That's not a good signal.
John, maybe 3 years from now, we're still talking about mortgage rates, with a 5 in front of it, or
that'll be a disaster. I don't know.
Right. I mean,
interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's a whole like this. I just think like, while we're talking about, the market obviously is heating up, there's no inventory, there's multiple offers again. I think it's still I still think that caution is warranted. I don't think this is oh, it's all clear, this is the new bull market, don't worry about it, just go and pay whatever you can for a house. I don't think that's the circumstance. I think there's a lot of risk out there right now.
100%.
But what John and I think doesn't necessarily move the market. What's moving the market, I think, is just 20-year lows in inventory, and people still need to live somewhere.
I agree with Steve. I would not conclude from what's going on in the housing market now that the worst is behind us, because it's still early. So I think people still need to be pretty cautious for sure.
And correct me if I'm wrong, guys, this is debt fueled propping up not only the government spending, but even homeowners basically are, if we're talking negative amortization, they're basically accruing debt at an amount that we don't normally see amongst homeowners, because they're not paying down their mortgage. Yeah. And if you're talking about, staying at these high rates, how long can this continue? Can it continue? Well, yeah, there was a viewer question about that. At some point, does it run out? Does the money train run out? And then we're looking at a recession, and a deep one too.
It starts becoming more problematic on renewal, because when people renew, you can't have a negative amortization, obviously. And yes, the banks might allow them to, maybe they were supposed to renew at a 20-year amortization. Maybe the bank lets them go to 30, but even at 30, they're probably going to see an increase in their payments, right? So I think most households, the second they have to renew, are going to have some payment shock, even if the banks let them extend their amortizations to 30 years again. You're still going to have an increase in your payments.
And there was a viewer question, Steve, about this. So the Canadians have loved spending on all kinds of consumer goods and all vacations and other things, because we have been for a very long time house rich, you can say. We're paying, people were not paying very much in mortgage, and they were seeing their prices increase, their household appreciation prices outpacing, what they were having to pay. Now, as that reverses, that money's coming out of the economy. What are the chances that there will be a slowdown in spending that will result in the type of recession that would lead to job losses, which historically does then tend to be one of the most direct links to falling house prices?
Yeah, I mean, I think like obviously, if you're taking more of your after-tax income and using it to pay off your mortgage because your mortgage payment's up, obviously that means you have less to spend at restaurants and grocery stores and new clothes. So yeah, I think but it takes time. It's funny because like talking about like potential job losses, like the Bank of Canada's targeting higher unemployment. Like they've basically come out and told you they need some people to lose their jobs in order to slow inflation. So it's coming. I think it still hasn't shown up in the data. So again, maybe that's the catalyst for slowing housing down. Maybe this is a spring blip. But as it stands, like I think if people want to keep it extremely simple, you just look at how many homes are active on the market and what's the months of inventory or what's the sales to actives ratio, and that's pretty much going to tell you in the short term where prices are going.
Right. So something to keep an eye on. It's a little bit, there's an ominous feeling out there.
It's a strange picture
it's
right
like,
now.
Like before the
And
storm kind of feeling.
To your point, Urmi, I think it's like not only are people going to have to pay more on their mortgages, but again, I think, and we talked about this in previous episodes, even flat prices for 2 or 3 years is massively problematic because a lot of our consumption was based on prices rising and people refinancing their mortgage and bundling their credit card debt into their HELOC and borrowing from their homes to buy pre-construction condos. And like, so even a period of a few years of flat prices could be massively problematic economically because our whole pre-construction condo sector is based on prices rising. Like none of it makes sense. People can't close if condo prices are not appreciating every year.
Right.
Well, yeah, there's all these like dynamics, right? I mean, you think about like someone like, needs to come up with $20,000 to put a new roof on their house or come up with a $25,000 check because their strata building is replacing all the windows. Like a lot of the times, like that's not necessarily paid with cash. It's paid by, hey, I'm going to go refinance the house and I'll pay for the $20,000 roof through that. Right. So, I mean, your house is the ATM in Canada. So it definitely plays an important role. And, hopefully this conversation kind of helps guide that.
Yeah, so we'll keep tracking. I mean, right now we're just seeing drips and drabs, a bit of an uptick in some consumer debt levels with credit cards and like some problem areas. I've seen some interesting stats around actually car loans, really accelerating the payments on those. And, it will be interesting. I mean, so far we're not seeing that one big sort of spillover is starting to happen, but it's something we'll have to track. I mean, and I've heard for a while that, so many households ran up a bit of a balance sheet because of COVID. I guess there was a lot of money saved on a lot of expenses as people were working from home and doing other things and couldn't travel. That might be another part of the equation, how long that cushion's there, and so we're just going to have to keep an eye on it. So now I think we should move to something like a little tiny glimmer of hope in the horizon on housing. And Steve, for that, we have to go to BC. I think it's fair to say that BC this month is a goal up on Ontario when it comes to housing, though we're looking at a phenomenally low scoring game. And this is because the housing minister, David Eby, I'm embarrassed to say I read so much news now that Eby. I just realized the other day, I don't know how anyone's name is pronounced. And there was a day where I'd watch all the news. So Housing Minister Eby recently announced some notable changes to spur home building. And Steve, you wrote a great Twitter thread about unpacking this. I really encourage everyone to go and check it out. Can you walk us through those changes announced here and the impact that you think they'll have?
Yeah, I think the big one was basically they're going to essentially override municipal zoning. So their claim, anyways, it's not into legislation yet, but it's supposed to be coming in the fall. Is basically they're saying on single family lots we want to basically override municipal zoning and allow multifamily missing middle housing, which is essentially townhouses, duplexes, potentially row homes, and so. Yeah, I think that's grossly what's missing. If you're a young family in Vancouver, and I'm sure Toronto's the same, most people are stuck with the decision of Either I buy a 2-bedroom condo and I raise my family in that, or I make a big leap and I go to a detached house. And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of construction for, again, townhouses, duplexes, that sort of basically people need, most young families need that third bedroom. And the only way to get it is basically by leveraging up into a very expensive detached house. So I think the majority of the land in the city of Vancouver is still zoned for single family. And an entry level tear down house in Vancouver starts at about 1.7 million pretty much just for the dirt.
Wow.
So the fact is, I think the zoning does need to be overhauled. It's going to be it will benefit the land owners in the near term. They're going to get an increase in density. That's good for their values. But I think in the long run, once the construction gets underway, you're going to see the benefit, I think, accrue to the families.
So the other piece that I saw, Steve, and just briefly before we moved on that, the landowners benefit because instead of building one house that would sell for X amount, they can build multiple units that together they could sell for more, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, typically anytime you increase density, you essentially end up increasing the value of the land. It is what it is. It's a tale as old as time. But the hope is, again, that, I mean, I can tell you factually that Calgary has a program like this where single family, the zoning is very lax, and they allow multifamily housing to be built on the single family lots, and builders go in there, they build them, they rent them, they sell them. A lot of young families, instead of buying a 70-year-old bungalow, much prefer a brand new duplex, and they'll buy one side. And so it's a very attractive option, and it's had great success in Calgary, and I think Vancouver will probably enjoy the same.
The other piece I saw was a proposal to legalize all basement apartments. BC, is that BC wide? Like, that would be huge if that happened in Ontario.
Yeah, I mean, most suites here are unauthorized, and it hasn't really hindered things.
That's the case
I don't
here
know how
too.
I don't know how you legalize them though. So it's always the devil's in the details, because like if you actually went to legalize a suite through most of these municipalities, like it can be very, very costly and very burdensome. You got to have fire rated doors, you got to have a separate electric panel, you got to have fire rated this, and it gets extremely complicated. So I'm not sure how the BC government's going to override some of this. So again, we'll obviously find out in the details, but will again.
Yeah, John, sorry, Steve, I'm just so curious about this because, John, in Toronto, the city of Toronto, informally, what a lot of people do is get all those fire checks. So everything is legal that way. And there's sort of this tacit under the table, like, that's okay. Technically, a lot of basement apartments aren't legal. It makes people worry if they want to buy a house and then put in a basement apartment to offset their costs. It at least deters some homeowners from doing that. Wouldn't something like a mass legalization of basement suites be huge, John?
Yeah, I mean, be pretty big. I mean, in Toronto, I like 90% of basement apartments are illegal. I mean, for the reasons that Steve said, no one wants to go through the headache of going to the city and getting all the permits and making every minor change, and like, just put them in and rent them out. And the city, for the most part, turns a blind eye. Like the city
doesn't. As long as you pass the fire stuff, though. There seems to be some kind of thing like
the fire, right? Fire tests are like the one thing where the fire department may go proactively and test, and even then, it's still allowed. It might give you a work order to make certain repairs,
right?
But the city generally doesn't proactively go in and raise issues with people with illegal basement apartments.
Yeah, but alternately, the fire checks are interesting because the inspectors don't then turn around and report that to the city. That, hey, we just did an inspection of an illegal suite.
Yeah, I don't think
they don't. So there's obviously some kind of strange, again, tacit, we know it's there, it's not really there. I really do think the legalization of basement question. And then, of course, we know that outside of the city of Toronto, this is a political issue, right? In Toronto, in Ontario, many municipalities in the GTA don't want to see that coming to their communities. So, I mean, I don't know. It's very interesting. We'll have to see what BC ends up doing there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that BC's putting all these measures in place. I mean, obviously, Ontario has been hinting at that. They've kind of done pretty much nothing. And these measures that effectively allow you to convert kind of single family homes into multiple homes, whether they're duplexes, triplexes, row houses, I think it's quite big. And quite frankly, I think the bigger issue is if you can sever lots and build 2 semis or 3 rows would be bigger than, building 4 plexes. Like, I don't think the math would work as well here. Like, at the end of the day, you're usually better off financially just demoing that home and building a luxury single family home than you are to build like 4 little apartments or whatever. But if you could, take a detached home and build 3 row houses, I mean, that would be pretty huge.
So something a little bit exciting, but of course we can't get too hopeful because we're talking about housing. John, you then tweeted, even the best premier who's doing everything possible to solve our housing crisis is going to fail miserably when our federal government's policies are designed to drive up home prices and rents. And you're responding to an article by Don Wright that asks, will Trudeau make it impossible for EV to succeed? So why are you agreeing with that?
I mean, that was his column. I mean, that was kind of his point. And I think there is he raises a valid point. I mean, when you're growing by 1 million people per year, you're not like all these measures to increase supply, as good as they are, you can't build faster than people want to move here. You know what I mean? Like, that's just, and it's not to say that the government shouldn't be doing them, but it just means that they're probably never going to be enough. You know what I mean? Because we're growing so quickly.
So one hand is obviously not talking to the other. Steve, you tweeted StatsCan just announced Canada's population grew on March 22nd. They announced it grew by over 1 million people in 2022, a record high and the most amongst advanced economies. There remains no housing plan in place. So clearly one hand is not talking to the other. It's and it's something that also was noted in that Scotia Bank piece that you're mentioning. Steve, I'm just going to show this tweet up on the screen and read a little bit from the excerpt. In a broader policy sense, Ottawa's housing strategy remains confusing. The bank is trying to contain inflationary pressures and soften raging house prices. The feds have thrown open, the federal government, they mean in this case, has thrown open the immigration doors into a market with no supply and introduce another tax subsidy to get housing starts up. So what's your sense, Steve?
I just think it's, Ron Butler always says, he jokes about it, which is so true, right? I mean, governments talk about affordable housing, but they never talk about getting prices down, which is the reality, right? But I mean, yes, there's a cohort, particularly my generation, that has really struggled to have access to housing, and it is the problem, I think, of the generation. But then you've got the other house, the other segment of the population, 68% home ownership rate in Canada, that doesn't really want their house prices to drop. That's their retirement plan. That's their equity. That's how they're funding a lot of their lifestyle. And so politically, falling house prices isn't a recipe, I don't think, to get reelected. And so I think we're kind of continuing to say, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to tax these guys, point fingers, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of real conversations, which is, if you want affordable housing, you just come out and say you need prices to fall.
Yeah, and by that you mean prices need to fall, which means demand needs to fall, which means we're looking at some of these immigration levels, we're looking at some of these incentives, and that's a hard conversation no one wants to have. So there's this tug of war, and in that tug of war, John, you point out that supply side always gets, it's the easy one. We'll just build more houses. Everybody says that. What's the solution?
I mean, if you wanted prices to fall, you could make them start falling tomorrow. I mean, OSFI can come out with a stroke of a pen from the direction of the federal government and say, okay, all these banks that have 20% of your loans that are non-amortizing or negative amortizing, okay, you're no longer allowed to do that. Either start paying all of your interest or sell.
Yeah, and then welcome to 2008.
You can change
US
policy.
Style. Yes,
exactly. Yeah. You can change policy at the stroke of a pen.
Well, John, we'll get on to I want to touch on you guys had a lot of great overall political pessimism tweets that I want to get to too, but, we don't even see a lot of proposals from anyone saying like, after your second home that somebody owns, prohibitive taxes, for example, like all kinds of measures could be there, but that's all the demand side. And that involves tough stuff that gets you unelected, I suppose. So I'm just going to announce that I'm going to build a lot of housing. And John, and in Ontario, that is exactly what happened in late March. The Progressive Conservative government of Ontario announced their goal, I think actually in 2021, to build 1.5 million homes over 10 years, reaching that target by 2031. So the budget release in Ontario showed that this is already well off track. The budget did even note that housing starts will be down over the next 3 years due to the financial cycles that we've just talked about. And this led the Ontario Housing Minister, Steve Clark, to suggest that it was interest rates and inflation that would thwart the realization of the Progressive Conservative government's promise, to which you responded, this is not surprise that they're finally admitting that the building homes is actually largely out of their control. It's not a lever they actually can control very well. They can announce it very well, but they can't actually make it happen very well. But then you go on to say, what is surprising is the number of people who are fooled by this and actually celebrated this target as if it was an achievable goal. And I have to say, as a former civil servant, the re-announcement of the announcement that happened before the announcement drives me nuts. Because if you actually try to track what numbers have actually been built and what's been happening, I know Mike Moffat's always on Twitter going, can anyone DM me municipal plans? Can you DM me to see what is actually happening? The answer is often a whole lot of nada.
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, the fact is you cannot double housing completions overnight. Even with all these changes, we have a labor shortage. We're building at max capacity. So, I mean, there was never going to happen. I mean, the fact is you can't control what the private sector does. Private sector is pulling back supply right now. So these were never realistic targets. I mean, it's just mind blowing that people actually pretended that they were. So anyhow, I think it's going to be a challenging market financially, whether you're renting or buying over the next, couple of years at least.
And Steve, I want to give the last word on this rather down, maybe it's a down note, but it has to be said. I liked your recent write-up on your blog or your Substack, Everything is a Choice. And you made the point, there's a great picture here, I think has every major political leader. I see Trudeau, Singh, Poilievre's in there. So that's a great picture. It's right up there. And you then go on to say, many of the issues we're facing today are policy decisions. They are choices. We're here because of choices. We're not here because something is out of control, out of their hands.
Yeah, they're all political choices. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we elect most of these individuals, not all of them, but like, for example, it was a choice to leave interest rates essentially at zero for the last decade, which obviously benefited these housing markets tremendously. And so whether it be monetary policy or, OSFI with their stress tests or no stress tests, or again, the federal government with immigration targets, who's to say we need 480,000 permanent residents? Why can't it be, 380? So these are all policy decisions. Just as it is on the municipal level with, approving density or not approving density, and so, I think at the end of the day, I think people need to direct their commentary and perhaps some of their frustrations towards the elected officials, and you do that through voting.
Yeah, but to be fair, and we'll keep tracking this issue, at the voting booth, there's a tug of war, right? Between those who have the homes and probably don't want to see some of these measures, and then those that would like to get in. So
wasn't it that old joke? It was like Tiff Macklem voted down like a density project across from his house.
Yeah.
I have to be honest, while politicians drive me nuts, we elect them and they reflect us. And I think this, this really like ineffectual middle of the road doing nothing reflects, I have to say, also a lack of a societal discussion on, what do we have to give up if we're not, what are we going to have to do? Not just worry that our kids won't be able to have homes. Right.
Yeah.
So I think so that would be my final thoughts, although I should leave them to you. You too, if you have any final thoughts. We're going to keep tracking them. You also blogged about great reactions to initiatives by all party leaders. So I think over the next few roundtables, I'm going to pull some of these proposals out. And why, again, John, to your point, they sound great. But if you have some knowledge of the issue, they're actually nothing. They're not effectual.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Very
All right.
good.
Well, another
It's a
really
long one
upbeat-
where it's a lot to talk about, a lot to digest. We'll have to get more into it next episode.
Yeah,
Sounds
yeah,
good.
for sure. So thank you again for joining us. Thanks to all our viewers for your questions and listeners for your questions. We couldn't get to all of them. Please keep them coming. We're on Twitter at Move Smartly. Our YouTube channel is Move Smartly. Our podcast Move Smartly. John is at John Pasalis on Twitter, and Steve is at Steve Soretsky on Twitter. And we'll see you next month. Hopefully it's sunny.
Awesome.